I'm Erica Kustra. I'm the past chair of the Educational Developers Caucus, and I'm the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Windsor. So we're gathered here from many different locations, and there are a few places on the earth that have not been called home by someone before. So the University of Windsor sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. So please feel welcome to share your land acknowledgement or your location in the chat and share that, because we are coming from so many different places. I am bringing you greetings and welcome all the facilitators who are leading the session today on behalf of Denise Stockley, who's the president of the STLHE. She really wanted to be here today, and she was called to a meeting on equity, diversity, and inclusivity for her University Queens, and so she couldn't make it, but she asked me to share her excitement about this topic and also her excitement about the upcoming STLHE EDI task force that is being developed now. The membership is being
post any questions you might have in the chat.
Yeah, please do. And we're bringing you welcome and facilitators.
And welcome everybody. We've got a bit of a smaller group today. So as I'm going through, if you have any.
Sorry, Erica, I just muted someone.
Okay, sorry. So I'm bringing you greetings on behalf of Denise Stockley. She's thrilled with the task force that is coming up, and it's going to be launched in September, which is very exciting. And she's also, and all of STLHE is truly appreciative of the constituency work. The groups are working on EDI and making it a priority in their work. And this particular session is a phenomenal example of a group of very dedicated people who are carrying and moving forward on the need to act on anti-Black racism. And it was initiated following the 3M AGM, and so are offering this session, Co-Constructing an Anti-Racist STLHE Community Demands for Us All. And it's a real pleasure to welcome and to promote this session. And I'm going to turn it over now to Carolyn with a couple words in the survey.
All right, thank you everybody for coming today. And we will see in the chat, there's been a link going up for the survey. So if you have not already, please go in and complete that. It helps get a sense of where our community is at. And I will be sharing the results in a moment. So as you can see, and we'll see some results still coming in, we do have individuals joining us from Nova Scotia, Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia, and the United States. And when we look at the roles, we have with us 6 students. We also have institutional senior leaders, deans, department leaders, educators, faculty and instructors, teaching center leaders, education developers, and librarian. And these numbers, as I said, will continue to update. We also, in looking at the state of campus, campus building access is restricted in 75% of the cases. People are encouraged but not required to work at home, and campus buildings are also closed in about 12% of those cases. And in terms of the fall status on campus, we're now looking at about 50% have most classes online with restrictions to specific ones. And we have all classes online, as well as some classes online, but some moving on campus, and about a quarter of the cases. In terms of winter, 77% are still in discussion, and about 16% have winter, with most courses online with specific restricted specific exemptions. So these are the kind of a sense of who's in the room and in this COVID times, what is happening on campuses. So if you don't have a chance yet, please continue to provide feedback. And I'll just show again who is joining us in terms of the roles, but we do have individuals from across institutional roles. Thank you also for including your welcomes in the chat and acknowledging the territories and lands that you're on. I'm very honored and pleased to hand over the mic and to Heather Carroll and her colleagues and our colleagues who are going to be leading the discussion today. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for taking time out of your day today to attend this webinar. As our facilitators, Erica and Carolyn, briefly mentioned, this was a group that was struck out of a desire to have this dialogue that came out of both the STLHE annual general meeting and the 3M Council annual general meeting. So we are a group of 3M fellows, both teaching and student. And I would just like to quickly introduce who will be speaking today and everyone who is involved, noting that there were lots of folks who contributed to this work who do not wish to be named, and also acknowledging that there's lots of people in the past with both the 3M Council and STLHE who have done this work in both acknowledged and unacknowledged ways. So today we'll be hearing from Chloe, Christl, Ethan, myself, Jason, and Tari, and acknowledging Maureen Connolly, who is also a signatory on this these lists of demands, which I will ask Chloe to quickly post in the chat because I can't do so when I'm sharing my screen, if you would like to preview them. But today's roadmap is basically, we're just going to share, well, we are sharing a little bit about us. We're going to quickly review the demands, and then we really hope to open it up to a community Q&A in the chat, so we can engage you in these demands, and if you have any questions about how they came to be or what our thought process was leading into them, that would be great. So without further ado, I would like to pass you over to Jason, who is going to review the purpose of our demands and this group and give you a little context before we begin.
Thanks, Heather. Jason Earl, 3M National Student Fellow from 2015 and Master's student at Queen's. We had a really rough spring this year with the deaths of many Black folks and Indigenous folks across Turtle Island. And we saw a response come from STLHE's president on June 2nd on challenging racism, on acknowledging that there are isolated events, but these isolated events are actually connected to systems of oppression throughout our society, which includes higher education, and it also includes STLHE. So building on that, we created this ad hoc committee specifically to look at how can we, STLHE and 3M Council, address through interrupting, destabilizing, dismantling ongoing anti-Black racism and white supremacy. And that has led us to these demands, which we're going to be sharing with you today.
Okay, I think Jason is handing off to me. Christl Verduyn, Mount Allison, currently speaking from Montreal, which is the traditional territory of the Mohawk and the Algonquin, or the Anishinaabe peoples. But my institution, of course, is Mount Allison, and it sits on the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. The very first discussions were wide-ranging, but as they boiled down meeting after meeting, we came down to this important topic of funding. I have to say, just before expanding on that a little bit, how rich it felt to work with the people involved in this group. We have a number of the student participants, well, the participants on the screen for this meeting, but it's been an amazing group, and I wanted to publicly thank the colleagues who had worked on these various demands over the summer months. And I tie that to funding because those who did so without any remuneration, any sort of compensation or recognition of the time that they were putting into it. And particularly, I think from a student perspective, this is super important. There are some students who had to pull back because that time really, they couldn't afford the time given other demands in terms of finding funding for their day-to-day lives. So this crucial first item about funding really reflects an acknowledgement of the amount of work and energy that goes into anti-racist work, particularly, I think, from the point of view of Black and Indigenous students. So that's a kind of an immediate recognition and need going forward, if we're to have a larger group, is to see that this work, which has been being done by the students in particular, you know, without any kind of support all summer, going forward, that just can't be the case. It has to have some sort of remuneration. So the other elements of this is that it shouldn't be a kind of a short-term one-off thing. It should be sustainable, ideally a dedicated budget line, and also transparent, how the funding, not just for this anti-racist work, but for all the funding opportunities through STLHE and 3M, that is whether it's awards or grants. So that's a long-term goal. And I think the importance would be for sustaining it. Kind of this first goal informs all the other ones that follow. Funding is necessary for building capacity, for bringing in people who can facilitate and move forward on some of the more difficult items that we're looking at in this presentation today. So I think that I can pass this off. We can discuss this further in the Q&A, and I'm handing it over to Ethan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ethan Pohl. I'm a PhD student at Queen's University in sociology. I got my BA from Bishop's University and my MA from Queen's. So I'd like to talk about our second demand here, infrastructure. The main heading here, we need to develop anti-racist infrastructure and positions within the 3M Council and STLHE at large. We have 3 sets of demands here, an immediate, a short-term, and a long-term demand. Our immediate demand, we require that 3M NTF and 3M NSF retreat facilitators have experience in using intersectional anti-racist approaches in pedagogy and facilitation. This is something that has been brought to our attention by previous 3M NTF and NSFs about the need for this. And the need to sort of generally take a more critical look at the way that these things are run. Our short-term demand for infrastructure need to enact a wide-ranging consultation with the STLHE community to determine infrastructural changes relating to anti-racism. The EDI task force, I just want to again note that we are not the EDI task force, we're different from them. But the EDI task force must address and be targeted towards confronting anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in higher education. And our long-term demand, we need to create positions, committees, and dedicated board seats to analyze and articulate how the structures of STLHE, including things like the 3M fellowships, the awards which are given out, how these are white settler colonial and how these contribute to things like anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, how they're, white supremacists, high heteropatriarchal, meritocratic, ableist. These positions which are created, they need to be long-term and incentivized with adequate compensation. As Christl noted previously, funding sort of underpins a large majority of our demands and the goals for anti-racism. It's fairly rampant that especially students and students of color especially are asked to do EDI work and sit on EDI boards and do this kind of labor without any kind of compensation. And also these EDI jobs are precarious as well. So once these issues are named and identified, strategies for transformation are created and implemented. And we also need to critically analyze our STLHE partners for their support of anti-racist goals. If STLHE partners are not doing enough to support anti-racist goals, then we need to re-examine our affiliation with them and perhaps divest if necessary. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Jason with capacity building.
Thanks, Ethan. Capacity building. First, let me preface this by saying racism, white supremacy, it operates at both the micro and the macro level, right? There are white supremacist ideologies, there are interpersonal interactions between people, And there's also institutional, structural, systemic racism that happens in our institutions, which includes STLE, which includes our 3M fellowships, which includes the institutions where we teach. So building capacity, it's something for everyone. All of us need to be part of anti-racist work, which demands that we ourselves build our capabilities of being anti-racist. So build anti-racist capacities within the 3M Council and STLE members at large, and root this learning in critical race and decolonizing theories, which centers Black and Indigenous scholarship. Our concern, why we're calling for this, is that there's a disproportionate amount of anti-racist work being put on the shoulders of Black and Indigenous people of color, subjecting them to harm that comes from working within a system that is white supremacist, settler colonial, ableist, cis heteropatriarchal. That is, we're asking Black and Indigenous peoples too much to change the system which is causing harm to them. We're saying that is violence in itself, and are demanding that the white folks, the settler folks, the people who are non-Black, non-Indigenous within STLE and higher education take on this work and take on our responsibilities, right? Anti-racism work is the responsibilities of all of us. And this is not about building an anti-racist community within STLE, it is making STLE anti-racist. Next slide, please. So to do this, we have short-term and long-term goals. The short-term is first to develop a code of ethics for all attendees within STLE, a code of ethics which sets the tone and sets the expectations of how we interact with each other in spaces we share, and which also lay out procedures and practices for when there's a breakdown in those relationships, right? Procedures and practices which work to restore relationships, which work through the violence, not through an authoritative way which produces shame, but works to heal, works to build, works to produce something sustainable and ongoing, and still tries to dismantle that racism, that white supremacy, the violence. Shifting to long-term. First, restructuring the Teaching and Learning Awards to value anti-racist work within institutions. And this requires us to also think about, well, for us to be able to restructure these awards, we also need the people who are capable of doing that, right? Which means that the people who are part of structuring the awards and adjudicating the awards and facilitating the awards also need to be on that anti-racist capacity building journey as well, right? Secondly, also creating ongoing opportunities through dedicated platforms, which Chloe is going to be speaking to in the next demand, for STLE members at large to learn in community about how systemic racism operates, how white supremacy operates, and also how to take transformative action in terms of unlearning and building anti-racist communities and institutions. And without further ado, passing it off to Chloé to talk more about that.
Hi, everyone. So like Jason said, a lot of capacity building involves the dedicated platforms that we need to build within STLE. So our goal is to ensure and sustain capacity building with dedicated time, space, and funding at all future conferences to address learning in the community. So again, we've divided it up into short-term and long-term goals. So for short term, we have ensure that the conference theme of STLE 2021 addresses anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in teaching and learning in Canada. So this absolutely must include sessions for STLE members at large to learn about systemic racism, going back to that capacity building, including how systemic racism operates in higher education, because we are all a part of that system. And for our long-term goals, we have all future STLE conferences and events center anti-racist pedagogy and explicitly welcome such presentations in the call for proposals. We must create ongoing opportunities for STLE members at large to learn in community about systemic racism and build anti-racist capacity. So this includes learning spaces, but could be more diverse than that, including book clubs or webinars, whatever the format seems most appropriate. And now I'll pass it on to Tari.
Hi, folks. So I'll be talking about the proactive nomination section. And this is a really important part, I think, of these overall demands, something that we all discussed, and certainly something that for me, reflecting as the first Black 3M National Student Fellow, is of considerable important concern. So generally, we want to make sure that we nominate Black and Indigenous students and faculty for 3M fellowships and for board, committee, and leadership positions and opportunities within the 3M Council and within STLHE. And so, as with the other demands, we've separated this into short and long-term goals. So we'd like, for the short-term goal, a formal and public apology signed by the chairs and vice chairs of both STLHE and the 3M Council for unaddressed systemic racism and subsequent harm to both current and past members of the 3M STLHE community due to racist behaviors, policies, omissions, or other things. So that there needs to be an acknowledgement within that, that racism is not limited to intentional and interpersonal discriminatory acts, but it's perpetuated in the ways that the university culture is rooted in white supremacy and settler colonial, ableist, and cis heteropatriarchal modes of reason and action. And for a long-term goal here, we'd like the 3M Council and STLHE to call upon its member institutions to promote and nominate Black and Indigenous faculty and students for teaching and learning awards, and the development of evaluation metrics to determine who is being nominated, who is winning, and where institutional barriers to equitable representation exist. It's really important to recognize that when we construct an artifice of meritocracy, we're in fact invisibilizing a whole set of processes, barriers, and procedures that may exclude Black and Indigenous faculty and students from actually engaging with these awards. And this doesn't just happen within our community, it also happens broadly within the institutions, the universities that feed into STLHE and the 3M Council. So with that, I'll pass it off to Heather to facilitate a Q&A, and thanks very much for your time.
So just to quickly review, the demands fall under these 5 categories of funding, infrastructure, capacity building, dedicated platforms, and proactive nomination. Now we are moving into the community Q&A portion of today's presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if you have any questions, could type that into the chat, and I'd be happy to facilitate whether it's a question directed in general at the group or at a specific one of these demands, which each person presented upon.
And I just want to throw it out there that I put in the chat, there's a link to a petition for everyone who wants to support. They can add their name to the demands.
So I wanted to say thank you, because I think you summarized beautifully some very complex and difficult areas. And I just wondered if you wanted to share a little bit about the process you went through to reach those, and how you see the group might contribute, in addition to signing, how you see the group here might contribute, continue to support.
So I will quickly try to answer that question, but then pass it off to anyone in the team who would like to add on to what I say. But this is a very collaborative and grassroots initiative that was just born out of these AGMs, and was born out of the fact that the president of STLHE made a statement that addressed anti-Black racism, but didn't really look within this organization. So we came together, and as Christl so well said, that there was a lot of students who support these initiatives and were involved at first, but had to take a step back just due to the time commitment, which is how we came about the notion that any student EDI labor must be compensated. This was all volunteer work. This was done by people who are really passionate about the organization, but this was not done in any official capacity. And just like Ethan said, we are not the EDI task force. So I don't know what the plan is on the EDI task force, whether student labor will be compensated, but hence why that's in one of our demands. For those who who are just hearing about this for the first time and who want to be involved moving forward, Chloe did circulate a link for people to attach their name as a signatory to these demands. And depending on the reaction and whether these demands are adopted or not, we will get in touch and plan next steps. Or if all of them are enacted right away, then maybe we won't meet again in the future. I don't know what the future holds, because I think now the ball is in STLHE and the 3M Council's court. But we are certainly welcome to anyone who would like to sign on to those demands and let us know that you're interested and build that community and that relationship moving forward. Would anyone else like to fill in where I left off? Jason, I see you nodding. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to expand on one topic. Heather spoke to students taking a step back from this work, from being on this ad hoc committee. I want to expand and note that there's also students who chose not to even get involved. I'm thinking of 2 students who I had dialogues with who opposed being a part of this committee because of their experiences as a 3M NSF within the retreat, within STLHE, and them experiencing STLHE as white supremacist, as colonial, and not having the energy to do this work without compensation or without people who are trained to facilitate this work, to ensure that if harm happens, that it will be worked through, it'll be addressed in a way that supports wellness, that supports the team continuing in addressing the violence, but also in supporting the anti-racist work rolling out in an anti-racist way.
Thanks for that, Jason. And there was a comment in the chat about the conference code of conduct under capacity building of not being aware of incidents. And I think that is definitely, I definitely agree. And I think that is a function of white privilege, of just not seeing the harm that is being caused and not being aware of that. And that's why in one of our demands, we also said, in the apology, that we would like it to be for harms known and unknown, and not that any harm is intentional, but even things that could have gone under everyone's radars. I see one more comment in the chat. Do you have any thoughts on how we can engage with constituent groups of STLHEs, such as SOTL Canada, EDC, and the anti-racist work to be discussed or done in those structures as well? I might ask Erica to speak a little bit. I know you're the former chair of EDC, not current, but if you could talk a little bit about what's happening at EDC. And then immediately I would just say you could forward this to those constituency groups and they could sign on to the demands. That would be a way to strengthen this, but they're also welcome to write their own as it suits their own context, because we are 3M fellows. That's how we came together. So we could really only speak to the 3M fellowship and then STLHE, not so much SOTL Canada. But anyway, over to you, Erica.
So I wanted to say thanks. This is an area that has been a concern for us for a while, and we've been trying to work on and develop slowly over the past years. But I think this year in particular, with Carolyn Hostler stepping into the chair, we have a number of initiatives we're bringing forward, and I think supportive, entirely consistent and supportive with the work that this group has been doing. I believe they're mutually reinforcing. So I'm going to actually, if it's okay, turn it over to Carolyn, because she's leading these initiatives right now. If that's okay.
So I want to honor the fact that people here were brave enough to speak, and it's not always the safest space to come forward in. And I wanted to say that I have a long history of listening to the 3M Fellows when they do their talks. I've also been honored with great conversations within EDC, including when Joy Mighty was chair of EDC way back when, but also more recently with other members about how the challenges people face when they walk in bodies that don't fit the systems they're in. And what I mean by that is the systems haven't been designed and created for everyone. So thinking about that, I wanted to acknowledge that this conversation is really important right now. It was important 10 years ago, and it continues to be important. What we have been doing has been specifically having an informal conversation about how to do this work. And this work questions about needs and the fact that there is diversity in our community there isn't diversity in our community. And I want to say that in the sense that those who have diversity have often left our community. And I know at least 3 individuals who have. But I also know that in our community, there is a lot of people who are diverse, but also not necessarily able to express that. So thinking about that, we have been having informal conversations starting in Erica's chairship around the needs and having a needs assessment there, particularly one with an EDI lens, having other conversations about what it means to our processes, our nominations, our appointing, and all those communities. But also we've been meeting intentionally with the exec and the members from our community who've done anti-racist, anti-oppressive work for many years. We've been meeting with them intentionally about what a good process looks like, because we've been told that there's a lot of unlearning to do before we actually construct any quote unquote solutions, because the solutions aren't band-aids. They have to be done through unlearning. So that's some of the work we've been doing in EDC. I will acknowledge that not all the work we've been doing has been always visible in the broader community, but I know that there's been real intentional work on this work and around indigenization and Indigenous knowledge in our community at EDC. And I want to thank my colleagues who've been doing this for about a decade or so.
Thanks, Carolyn. And that segues into another comment in the chat. And I think, Ethan, you said you're comfortable speaking to this, which were non-colonial actions and structures considered. Perhaps they are embedded in the abstractions of the labels. I can say that we specifically decided to address anti-Black racism because that was in response to the statement by the president. That's not to say that we're not interested in anti-racism in general. And in some of the demands, we did intentionally say Black and Indigenous scholars or Black and Indigenous faculty. But Ethan, would you like to chat a little bit about where we can decolonize and how that was embedded in our work?
Sure. Yeah. So the decolonization work is something that is incredibly necessary and is something that we did try to embed into our demands. I think it's important to realize that anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, a lot of these things come from the same sort of root of the poison tree in white supremacy, and this idea that white people, white structures, and white actions are inherently better. So this is sort of what we're trying to challenge here with these demands. And again, while we were directly focused on anti-Black racism, we tried to make our demands sort of such that they would challenge other things as well, and really take a stand against white supremacy in higher education. But again, I think something that's important to acknowledge is that, you know, this isn't an authoritative list. We aren't the end-all be-all experts on racism in higher education. These demands are a starting point. They're sort of what we came up with as the absolute must do right away in order to begin the long and challenging work of dismantling these structures of oppression in higher education. So while our demands are not perfect, this working group is not perfect in any way, but what we're trying to do is to challenge these ideas and to create a community and a higher education landscape where it's much more possible to challenge all forms of discrimination and all forms of white supremacy and anti-people of color thoughts, actions, and manifestations. So I think there was also another question in there as well. And I think Jason's going to take that. So.
Yep, and that was the question about, I'm just paraphrasing, I can't really find it in the chat, but is there room to advocate for inclusion of marginalized identities in educational development, including Brown and Asian communities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. To amplify what's been already said, right? When we formulated this ad hoc committee, we were specifically focusing on how we can address anti-Black racism, given the events that were happening in the spring, given the message that was communicated by STLHE president, and given the need for there to be a specific focus on addressing anti-Black racism. The proposals, the demands that we are making, right, have the potential to open up anti-racist learning and unlearning that includes a spectrums of race and ethnicity, right? If we think specifically about the infrastructure demand, right? Demanding that we hire someone who is an expert in anti-racism, demanding that we develop platforms for learning anti-racism, right? There's opportunities within those spaces for them to not only engage with anti-Black racism, but also anti-Asian racism, anti-Brown racism, anti-Indigenous racism, right? And my hope is that within that openness, right, of anti-racism work, that inclusion will be done. But I would like to hold centered for us that this work that we are focusing on in these demands is to address anti-Black racism. And so often when throughout history, I'm thinking of multiculturalism, and we can turn to Eve Tuck's paper called Curriculum Replacement and Settler Futurity, if you want to look into this. She unpacks how multiculturalism was co-opted and turned into diversity and inclusion, where Black radical voices were asking for systemic change, and white academics and activists co-opted that and basically watered down Black activists' calls to action. And I'm not using that to respond to say that, you know, thinking about other forms of racism is watering down what we're trying to do. But what I am trying to say is we need a space right now to look at how are we responding to anti-Black racism, and to ensure that we follow through with that.
Thanks, Jason. And I think, Tari, you also wanted to add something?
Yeah, just to build on what Jason said, I think that it's really important to recognize that white supremacy operates within hegemony, right? And so there's a kind of structure here that facilitates oppression on the backs of others, right? So who do we push down to the bottom so that we can claw closer towards whiteness? And in that structure being upheld, we then get this kind of mechanism and this process where we're all asking, you know, can I get into, or, you know, as a cis man, can I use my privilege to push someone else down? So the point, and I think I see it also being made in the chat, the point is that when we dismantle these hegemonies, we hopefully will all be liberated from that kind of process of pushing others down and from pulling others down. And I think that that's the real point here. That's, you know, orienting our work and our activism towards those who have been most oppressed, those who have been most discriminated against within our community and broadly within higher education, does not preclude the oppression or the discrimination against others, but rather it recognizes that it's the underpinning of a system that harms us all. So that's what I wanted to add there.
Thanks, Tari. And we have another question from the chat. It's a little bit further up, but there was a discussion about the awards and how they're structured. That we are welcome the demand to revisit the 3M criteria and structures. So a participant says that at their institution, which is a college, the requirement that student awardees be current students has significantly disadvantaged access to the award, particularly for BIPOC students. And we have several specific examples of encountering these barriers. I could not agree more. And I just would like to share a little bit of my personal story as a 3M student fellow who was involved in the coordination of the award for a little bit. So the award coordinators have 3-year terms. So I was working with Maureen Connolly, who was actually also a huge influence in making these demands. She couldn't make it here today for the presentation, but she is one of the public signatories to these demands. And one of our presenters, I think it was Christl, mentioned that, and Carolyn, that the student fellows have been way ahead of this discussion for many, many years. Like this discussion has been happening at the student level for as long as I've been involved. And that's not necessarily to pat us on the back, but that is to say that students are pushing these conversations forward. And even as you see today, the majority of the presenters here are students. So going back to the award coordination level, when the current award coordinator took on the award, she promptly fired all the student co-coordinators. So myself and Anita were just let go with no reason, no accountability. Like I had an email one day saying, "Hi, can you send me your bio and your headshot?" And then the next day it was, we no longer need you. And from that point, all of our questions to the current 3M student fellow coordinator has been pushed up to the board level and pushed back. And students really have no involvement now, and we've been deliberately kept out. So, but I can't say that that's been the case with my involvement on the council. So I want to be really distinct with those two things. So the 3M council has been very welcoming of student perspectives as far as I've experienced. But the 3M student fellowship as it currently stands is very resistant to change and is not open to community feedback. So I know the award is currently being restructured. So that's why we hope that these demands and your feedback and the community discussion such as this will make it to that committee of who's restructuring the awards, what it values and why. But just to let you know that there is a significant disconnect in what the awards coordinator is doing right now and the level of engagement and involvement that the students want. Tari, I think you wanted to speak a little bit about the awards as well.
Yeah, this is something I'm really passionate about, and it's something that really gets to me. Again, I didn't really recognize it at the time, but when I won the student fellowship in 2014, I did so from a kind of positionality and from a perspective that wasn't the norm either on my campus or kind of within the broader context of Canadian higher education. At the same time, I had a lot of privilege, right? But I felt that the 3M was this kind of uniquely positioned award to recognize students who were not otherwise seen by their institutions. That in being dynamic, in pressing back, in being bold, in being broader in their scope than kind of the very narrow forms of kind of institutional platforming and success that currently exist, the 3M National Student Fellowship could really open up some doors for some folks who would otherwise not walk through those doors. And it's something that I believed in so much that I was an adjudicator for the fellowship. And it's something that I've believed in such that, you know, I'm still a member of the community to this day. And so it's incredibly dismaying that at every turn, when that kind of ad hoc capacity to include voices that would otherwise no longer be within the context of the award, at every time when that ad hoc process has been tried to be institutionalized, things have been shut down. And I reflect now, I'm a PhD candidate. One day, perhaps I'll be a tenured faculty, maybe I won't. But at any stretch in period of time, as a Black person, the amount of work that I have to do within my community, not only to educate others, but simply to keep above water in terms of like, I have to do anti-racist education just so that I can get through a day. I have to do anti-racist education just so that I'm not having harm reflected upon me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I cannot imagine the kind of burdens that Black faculty, Indigenous faculty, other faculty who are people of color have to take on, also in terms of mentoring students. And their university systems never, ever truly reflect that in any kind of meaningful support, and certainly not in kind of uplifting those folks for these kinds of awards like the 3M National Teaching Fellowship. That's why, as far as I'm aware, and you could correct me, I think in the history of the 3M National Teaching Fellowship, there have been 2 Black people that have ever won. That strikes me as absurd. And so I think it's high time for us to institutionalize a form of change and to press back not only within our community, but also within the constituent institutions to say, you are not valuing Black and Indigenous faculty enough. You are not valuing their labor, you are not valuing their time, you're not valuing their commitment, and you are doing incredible harm in doing so. And as a last kind of wrap-up point, I would like for folks to read the book, The Equity Myth. It came out a couple of years ago, but it really kind of highlights the way that Canadian higher education at large is a form of attrition for Black and Indigenous folks. It pulls them out of positions of any kind of authority, it pays them less, and their workload is higher. So I think we really need to educate ourselves on that, and I'll kind of wrap up there.
Perfect. And just keeping an eye on the time, I know Pat is the chair of the 3M Council and he's here and he's been a little active in the chat. So I'll pass it over to you, Pat. No pressure to make any responses to the demands, but yes, over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to sit quietly, but I also wanted to share my support for all of this. And so, you know, recognizing my own privilege as a middle-aged white man who's a university administrator, wearing my personal hat, absolutely, I agree with the demands and will sign the petition now that I know the petition is there. Wearing my 3M Council hat, I am more than committed to bringing it to the Council Executive in our first fall meeting. And, you know, I do already recognize that, you know, Heather, Christl, Maureen, et cetera, are also on that Council Executive. And I'll go one further and say that as a STLE board member, which, you know, I have the privilege as 3M Council Chair to sit on the STLE board, I'll certainly push the buttons there. And, you know, I just want to lay that out there to say that if you have these concerns, and there are, I completely agree, systemically racist structures in place, and I fill some of these voids, and I'm willing to take it forward as an awkward ally, as someone who does care and does listen. And I do appreciate the strength of the fellows, particularly the student fellows here, who have spoken out about this, who have taken it upon themselves to act in this ad hoc working group capacity because they see inactivity happening through the current structures and possibly through the EDI task force that's happening simultaneously. So I just wanted to make that commitment. Now I'll shut up again and continue listening.
Thanks, Pat. And I would invite anyone, any questions or comments, whether they're logistical or probing or really anything. We do have a few more minutes left if anyone would like to touch base in the chat. And I might ask Chloe again to post the link to the Google form if you'd like to add your name as a signatory to these demands. That's not just limited to 3M fellows or even STLHE members. Truly anyone is welcome to sign on if you agree with these demands or would like to see them, some more weight put behind them as they get presented to the 3M Council and the STLE board in September. Thanks, Chloe.
I also wanted to, this is Erica, I just wanted to say thank you. These, I think, are fundamental things that each of us can take back with us and think about in our own practices, in our own classrooms, in our own positions, in our own institutions, as well as in STLHE and the constituency groups we're part of. I think these are very practical principles that underlie many, many actions. And I think they're very powerful because of that. And I think if you take away the demands and look at them, you can identify your own actions under each that will help support those demands in your own personal way, in the way you can help move forward. And I think that's very powerful. So thank you to this group for articulating them that way and for sharing them and for having this open conversation. Thank you.
Cherie asks, will this recording be available to share with others? Yes, generally the Keep Teaching webinars are, well, this one is currently being recorded and they are posted on the keepteaching.ca website about a week, 2 weeks after. I know there's some processing time, and I've included the link to the demands, and we will work on putting out the way to sign on to the petition, both on social media, but hopefully will be linked with the webinar on the Keep Teaching website as well. But yes, anyone, regardless of your role, regardless of your institution, can share the demands, and the form to sign your name onto the demands, like, that's free to share. Oh, and Lisa says in the chat, as a project lead for the 3M Fellow Mentoring Network, I think that there is some possibility for building capacity there as well. Absolutely. This list is not meant to be an exhaustive list. If you are sitting here on this webinar and thinking that you can do something within your role, whether that's on the 3M Council, EDC, SOTL Canada, there's, you know, a million different ways, or just as a member at large, if you're thinking that there's a way to get involved and push this forward, please do get in touch. And yeah, like I said, this is definitely not an exhaustive list. This was written from our position as 3M fellows.
And if I can add one more thing that was touched upon, and that's the revamp of the 3M National Teaching Fellowships and National Student Fellowships. Again, because of my position, I do sit on that committee, and I can comfortably say that, you know, these concerns, I will bring them to that group, certainly. And I think some of them have already been reflected in the work of that group. Now, much of the work of that group is still ongoing before it's brought back to the STLHE board for approval, but I can certainly commit to that and having it part of the current revamp process. Not that it won't need further revamp, because the setup is still the setup now is still within a system that is inherently racist.
So I wanted to say, we're heading into the last few minutes. I wanted to formally take a few minutes to say thank you on behalf of STLHE, and of course, from my perspective, thank you from EDC as well. As the past chair, this is phenomenal to see moving forward, and I do think they are demands for us all. Like, I think this is something that the entire society needs to think about and engage in. So I appreciate the fact that we are going to move forward. We need to move forward, and having the steps to do it clarified, I think, will be useful for STLHE overall, but individual members within. So thank you to Tari, to Jason, Heather, Ethan, Christl, Chloe, who are here presenting, and to everyone behind the work who made the conversation and discussion possible. Thank you to all of you. And I look forward to seeing the work continuing to move forward from everyone contributing as we go forward. Thank you.